Hello and welcome to Crisis What Crisis. I'm Andy Coulson, former newspaper editor, Downing Street Director of Communications and one-time inmate of HMP Belmarsh. Over the last 6 years, I've put all of my experience, the good and the bad, to use as a strategic advisor to business leaders. And I can tell you that the bad has been just as useful as the good. And that got me thinking that there are plenty of great podcasts out there where you can hear stories of success, but there are far fewer where you can benefit from the experiences of those whose lives have properly unraveled. So on this podcast, you'll hear from the embattled and stoic, the shamed, courageous, ruined, damaged, unlucky and lucky survivors of crisis, all talking in the hope that they might serve as a useful guide to anyone facing down their own demons and challenges. Crisis What Crisis is generously supported by Mindstream, a brilliant company who harness the power of music for personal well-being and improving human performance. Just search Mindstream, that's Mind with a Y, on Spotify, and you'll find some great playlists. My guest today for this bonus episode is a man who has lived his professional life over 4 decades at the sharp end of some of Britain's most dramatic and disturbing crises. In his role as a forensic pathologist, Dr. Richard Shepherd has undertaken over 20,000 post-mortems and was fully immersed in the Hungerford mass murders, Marchioness disaster, 7/7, 9/11 and the Bali bombings. His work has helped solve some of the worst individual crimes of modern times, including Harold Shipman and Robert Napper. His best-selling first book, Unnatural Causes, tells the story of his work and the toll it took on his own life, leaving him deeply impacted by PTSD and a depression that almost drove him to suicide. So this is not a conversation for the faint-hearted, but I can tell you it's utterly compelling, largely because of the clarity and frankly, at times, humour that Richard brings in telling his incredible story. Richard's work and the breakdown it caused has given him a perspective that very few others have on death, of course, but also on what it is to survive crisis both professionally and personally. This is a conversation about crisis at its most visceral and therefore meaningful. A conversation about death, which I found to be really life-enhancing. And I hope you do too. My thanks to Richard for joining me, and you'll find links to his autobiography and his brilliant new book, The 7 Ages of Death, in our notes for this episode. If you enjoy it, please give us a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or reach out to us at Crisis What Crisis Podcast on Instagram and Facebook. Dr. Richard Shepherd. Dick, welcome to Crisis What Crisis, and thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, my pleasure.
I've been so looking forward to chatting to you today. During the course of this podcast, we've explored crisis from a range of different perspectives, if you like, people who've survived all manner of different types of crisis. But you've lived a professional life where every professional day you've been immersed in crisis. We'll talk about, if we may, the impact that's had on you a bit later.
Yeah.
But reading your books, and they are utterly compelling. It's hard not to draw the conclusion that part of you was, maybe part of you still is, addicted to crisis. Is that unfair?
No, I'm very interested you choose that because now having written the second book and looked at it, and I talk so much about solving puzzles. But on the other hand, you could say resolving crises.
Yes.
And that's is it just the same side of a coin, or is it two opposite sides of a coin? My life was spent going into crises. I mean, small crises, domestic stabbings, road traffic accidents, sudden natural deaths. These are crises. I mean, they're so huge to the family, but as the professional coming in, you have to come in with a calm overview and do your best and try and resolve it as best as you can for that family. And that family is so much in crisis. You have to do your bit to understand the medical side. I can't do everything. I can do the medical side, and to take them through that and hopefully send them away better prepared for the grieving that they're going to have to do.
Yes.
So there's the personal crises, but then you things like World Trade Center, which are sort of major international crises, which are totally different.
Yes, this is the thing I'd like to start with, really, because you've been intimately involved with some of the biggest cases, disasters, as you describe, mass murders, terrorist attacks, individual cases of real horror. You've carried out more than 20,000 post-mortems. You've seen the absolute worst of what mankind is kind of capable of.
Yeah.
And the impact it has, as you say, on those families that are left behind. Your job, I suppose, is to sort of learn from the dead in a way. But what have you learned, about the resilience of the living from those relatives that you describe, with whom you are sharing the worst moments of their lives?
I think I've learned that, as with so many things, that some people are phenomenally resilient, and some people have an inability to cope with anything more in their lives. And sometimes it's because when I'm talking to them, this is the last of a whole series of events, unpredictable series of events. And then suddenly there's a death in the family, and this just takes them beyond that pale. And I can really relate to that. But, people are, when you're talking to people about the death of their relative, I'm constantly trying to judge how much information they are wanting me to give them. Some people will want every little detail. Some people really want broad brushstrokes. So but talking to relatives is, I see, very much part of my job, and getting them to understand. Sorry, getting them, that sounds very hard. Helping them to understand what has happened. Because I know, because my mum died when I was 9. She went into hospital. She never came home. Nobody really told me about it. I never went to her funeral. And it became a sort of a gap in the family rather than something that was faced up and dealt with. And I'm conscious that caused me real problems not having that understanding. And I don't want other people to find themselves in that same position of guessing what might have happened, because we know in medicine, and I'm sure this is shown up again by psychology, if you leave people to guess, they will always guess worst.
Right.
They will never guess, it would have been a nice, easy death. It would have been very gentle. They wouldn't have felt any pain.
Right.
It's always, it would have been agonizing and slow and terrible. And sometimes it is. And that's the truth. And you have to face that.
Yes.
But often it's not. And we can help them to get through to the reality, because that's the bedrock of their grieving.
You mentioned the loss of your mum. You were 9. She died, I think, from heart disease.
Yes.
And you analyse that very well in a fascinating way in the book. It's that loss, but also your stumbling across Simpson's forensic medicine as a child. That kind of, those two things kind of lead you towards pathology. Give me a bit. Give me a little bit more of a flavour of why you chose that life. When, as a medic, there were so many options open to you, presumably.
Oh yes.
Do you remember the kind of moment when you thought, what, actually, yes, this is where I want to be. This is where I can make a difference.
Well, that moment actually was when I was 13. That moment was in the toilets at the Watford Boys Grammar School when I first saw this book.
Yeah.
And the first 7 words of that book are what to do with a dead body. And from then, really? Goodness, I was hooked. Now, I think my dad was quite clever. He used this lever of me wanting to do this as the thing to get me to study and to work and to do O levels and A levels. But it was the thing that kept me focused when I was working to get the exams to get to medical school. But when I got to medical school, I wasn't a fixed entity, because of course I came across all sorts of new things in medical school. Surgery, I came across, actually the other thing that absolutely fascinated me was obstetrics and gynecology. And here's something very different. And as the psychologist said, that's really interesting, because you spend a life dealing with the dead, and yet the other alternative in your binary choice in your career is dealing with the birth and the start and the regeneration. So so I tried all of these careers. Each time I came along, we had attachments for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 6 months, whatever. And I loved them all. Some more than more. I mean, I never really got on with psychiatry, I have to say, but that's which is interesting. But
Yes.
I love them all. But each time the pendulum swang back through forensic pathology, when it passed by, the bells rang loudest.
But there is that binary moment as well, isn't there, with forensic pathology, where the moment comes when you are, stood in front of a dead body.
Yeah.
And your job now is, the scalpel is in your hand, and your job is to start the analysis. And that's I suspect for that group of students who were thinking maybe this is what I'm going to do. That's the moment, isn't it, where you discover actually whether or not you're capable. Yes,
and that was quite a serious moment, because as a young medical student, it's coming, and it's not sort of day one. It's probably week 2 or 3.
Yes,
and the tension is building, and then you go into the room and you sit down, and there's lots of bodies prepared for the dissection, covered in white sheets, and it's all there, and then it's up to you. And there's a moment where you take a deep breath and you wonder whether you're going to be able to do it. And I did. And in the end, it wasn't a problem. But are there not lots of points in life that we all have, different points, that actually, you take a deep breath and you say, yes, I can do it, or you say, no, thank you very much.
Yeah, that is an extreme one, though, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, handling and looking at and dissecting another human being does, I think, take you into a different space in your mind and in the world, because it is such a horrendously destructive thing to do, and yet it is so fascinating and exhilarating and stimulating at the same time,
and so fundamentally important.
Exactly, and it has to be done, or it had to be done then for medical practice to understand what was going on. So it was there, but it was more than a lot of people did it because they had to, but I did it in the end because it was. We all have the same muscles in the same place, supplied by the same nerves and the same arteries and veins. How has this happened? It is just phenomenal.
Yes. Your fascination in it is, as you can, I can see it as I'm talking.
It is.
Now. People listening to this can't unfortunately, but you can see just how much it means to you and how engaged you are in it. Look, quite early in your career, 1987, you were called to attend the scene of a mass murder in Hungerford. Yeah. Michael Ryan shot and killed 16 people, and indeed himself. Most of those people were going about their normal lives, getting in and out of cars, mowing lawns, etc. Nothing like that had ever happened, I think, in the UK before.
No.
A real sense of horror that you suddenly find yourself, immersed in, thrown into. Really, you're the town's shut down, and you're driven in to start your work. Tell us just a little bit about that day. Because you were witnessing something so visceral. How did you find your focus? That is the epitome of a scene of crisis. How did you find your focus? What's the voice in your head saying at that moment?
I think the voice in my head is saying, this is such an important thing for Hungerford, the town. Yeah. It was the first time we'd had a spree killer in the United Kingdom. Now, I've been fortunate because I used to go to international meetings, and sadly, as we know, particularly around schools, they have lots of spree killers in the States. So I'd been able to talk to my American colleagues, my international colleagues. So I had some idea of how to manage these things, or how they manage them, and what might need to be done and how it might be managed in the UK. So in a sense, I was prepared. That was part of my training and my peripheral experience. Now, I'd heard about Hungerford as I drove home in the car. It was on the news headlines, and then my pager went off in the days before mobile phones, and I knew the code for Thames Valley Police, so I knew it was them. got home and was actually, after a quick phone call with Thames Valley to arrange to go to Hungerford that evening, I was straight into family life. But we had 2 young kids, I mean, 6 and 4 or whatever they were at that time. My wife was a medical student. I was involved in kids for 2 or 3 hours. And maybe I think that was a good thing, because that just took a little bit of the pressure off. The police didn't want me early. They wanted me when things were settled. So there was no pressure there. When the kids were in bed, I was able to get into the car and drive out to Hungerford. And that was a sort of 2-hour drive, which is always good time for me, that settling time, that transition time from being a dad who's just read bedtime stories to a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old to an expert forensic pathologist who's going to go into a town with 13 or 14 dead people that I was going to have to manage. Each case was unique. Each case was individual. Each case had to be managed properly. And there
was also this suggestion that Ryan himself perhaps hadn't killed himself. Indeed, special forces somehow or the other had got there first. So you're tasked with establishing that fact.
Yes,
as a fact, and you're led into the classroom where his body is to kind of analyze that.
And everyone was trying to understand it on that day. But going into that room, his body was propped in the corner, and the police quietly disappearing out of the door and shutting it, leaving me on my own, having told me that he might have a bomb on him. I felt was
extraordinary. So tell me that's that moment.
That moment.
Okay. What's in your head?
Well, what's in my head is this smells like a classroom in a school, because classrooms in schools have a very particular chalk, sweat, I don't know what child.
Yes.
And my sense of smell was locked into that. And then through that came the smell of discharge of a weapon and a slight smell of blood. And then it was focused down on Ryan, carefully walking across the room. I'm not sure what I'd have done if he'd moved. I think I would probably have run out the door very fast, but it was focus on him. I could see the gun. I could see the gun in his lap. It hadn't moved. I knew it hadn't moved for the last 4 hours or so, so I wasn't expecting him to suddenly lift it and fire it. But I had to look at him to understand where he had shot himself and how he had shot himself. And without moving him, because of the possibility of there being a bomb on him, I was able to do that and then trace the entry on his right temple, because it had classic features of a burning that was typical of a gun, and he had a gun in his right hand, exit wound in his left temple, and then I could look across the classroom, and in the notice board on the far side, embedded in someone's bit of artwork, was the bullet that had gone through his head and across the classroom and embedded in there. So I was able to go out and say, it's a suicide. You can go and make that announcement now. There is no, they knew there was no involvement of special forces, but, he's now been examined and that's the case. And from there, we had to manage his body because that was most important, and then just work our way around the town, quickly assessing each one and making decisions about how to recover the body back to the mortuary.
Goodness. 30 years later, or thereabouts, as I understand it, you are flying your light aircraft. You love to fly. We'll talk about that a little bit later as well. And you look down and you realise that you are flying over Hungerford. Yeah. And you begin to, you begin to unravel.
Yeah.
The first signs, it turns out, to be first signs of a fairly slow moving but very definite breakdown.
Yeah.
You get a grip of yourself. Obviously, you land your plane.
Yeah, it's not a good place to actually.
No, indeed. You sort of reflect on it, but sort of bury it again, as I understand it. But much later. It is the beginning, but it is later that you begin to realize actually there's something going on here that is a real problem for you.
Yes.
Can you talk to me a little bit about that process and that kind of realization in the first instance?
I mean, humans are infinitely able to deny the bloody obvious. especially when it's about themselves. We all do it. We all know it. We all know we do it. And so, having had that funny turn, very bizarre turn, never experienced anything like that before. Landed, did my job, flew home again, sat down in the evening, and just thought, oh, I'm fine. There's nothing to it. But as you say, it had started to change, and it was how long later? Maybe a month or 2 months later. There'd been a few ripples, but nothing much. It was putting the ice from a supermarket bag of ice, and that's crucial that it was from a supermarket bag of ice into my wife's gin and tonic. That chink of the ice was the thing that effectively just snapped the links with reality, and I was just unable then to carry on.
And that was the link to another scene, frankly, of horror that you'd been immersed in, and that was the Bali bombings.
That was the link to the mortuary at the Bali bombings, where Bali was a very poor country. They didn't have refrigeration. They couldn't bring it in because it was containerized and there weren't the containers. So they had just got bags of ice from the supermarket and had used those bags of ice to put on the bodies on the ground. And it was that link. I mean, people would say, what's it like seeing dead bodies or injured bodies or fragmented bodies? It wasn't that. It was a bag of ice that actually was the key that split me and really took me completely away from myself and reality into a very distressing and unhappy place for quite a few weeks.
And this was PTSD?
This was PTSD, yes.
And were you diagnosed quite swiftly, or were you resistant?
No, I'm very, very lucky in that my wife, who's also a doctor, I'm afraid, as wives and good partners often do, if I can put it this way, took absolutely no crap at all. I was taken, if not the next day, then the day after, to a psychiatric emergency department, and I was seen there, and that team were just absolutely fantastic. I mean, I have such admiration for their skill and ability to manage me, to help my family,
yes,
and then to treat me and to help me through the really hyperacute phase, which lasted for a week or 10 days, and then support me for the next few months afterwards.
Can I ask you, if it's not too insensitive, how dark did it get for you?
Immediately after that night with the ice cubes, I was thinking about how I was going to kill myself. I mean, and I knew how I was going to do it. And there were, one of the questions that is always asked is, okay, have you thought about it? Yes. Have you made any plans? Yes. Have you actually planned to do it? Yes, I had. And one of the absolutely brilliant mental health nurses who came around to see me every day for 10 days or 2 weeks said, the thing that scares me, Dick, he says, a lot of people talk about it, but you actually know how to do it. You've seen it. You know what
you'd planned. You'd started.
I had planned. I was well on the way, and these guys, my wife and family, wrapped themselves around me, and helped me through that, and then gave me the will to cope and to work through it, to talk about it and to discuss it. And there's help from a great drug called sertraline as well, which was fantastically useful for me. So all of the modalities, professional and personal, came together, and I was just so lucky. If I hadn't had them, if I, for whatever reason, had been on my own, or that support hadn't been there, I'm sure I would have gone through with it. I have, it was that clear and certain in my mind.
What was the plan, if I can ask such an insensitive question?
Well, my plan was to drive into a lorry coming in the opposite direction on a dual carriageway.
Goodness. And in your state of mind at that time, that was in an entirely logical way.
Absolutely.
To end your life. Yeah.
And once again, these great mental health guys said, "What do you think that would do to the lorry driver?"
Yeah.
And suddenly they took it away from being my issue.
Yes,
it's someone else's, and that was,
Indeed.
they are so fantastically clever, these guys.
Yes. But I know also that if I've understood the timing correctly, there was also this issue, and I'm really interested in talking to you about the other aspect of your job, which of course takes you into courtrooms frequently. The accumulation of your work, the horrors as we're beginning to discuss that you'd experienced, I assume it just kind of built up over a long period of time, along with the day-to-day of your job in itself must have been so mentally challenging. But then, as I understand it, there was this extra layer as well. Your integrity was, being questioned. The GMC inquiry, we should say very clearly, misplaced, wrong. You were totally exonerated, but the process was a very long-running one, 18 months. So you've done all this work, and now your integrity is under question. I assume was another layer of agony for you at that time.
Yeah, it is something I think every doctor fears, is a GMC investigation, and we know that a significant number of doctors it terminates their career because they simply can't cope with the stress and strains. But for me, it was another issue that was running along that had to be managed, and it takes away, your self-esteem is so important. And when someone's kicking away at that stool that's underneath you, it's very, very hard to keep going.
Yes. And the key message here is, very obviously, get the help.
Yeah.
Spot the signs.
Yeah.
Get the help. And society is not very good at training us to spot the signs, is it? Because actually what we're taught is, suck it up. Particularly if it's your job.
Yes.
Particularly for someone like yourself who is thrown into these situations. I know that you've got very strong views on the kind of lack of support for colleagues. And there's one story that you mentioned in the book, which we'll touch on very quickly. But in the aftermath of 9/11, you found yourself in New York. You're working with American colleagues. One of those colleagues was so distressed by the process of identifying bodies and body parts that she then wrote her name. Every time she took a flight, she would write her name on each of her limbs, in case the plane crashed and in case
Yeah.
I mean, that is just if that's not, your story, of course, is, but sitting alongside that, the idea that someone would be driven to that kind of logic, if you like.
9/11 changed so many people's lives. I mean, I'm very pleased that lady stopped flying, not surprisingly, perhaps for quite a while, but is now back. She's sought help, got help, and now manages it. But for so many of us, that was, a bit like Hungerford in the UK. 9/11 was, no one had seen it before. How do you manage 3,000 deaths and 27,000 fragments of humans that you've got to try and somehow fit back together? I mean, we have to manage the process. It's our job. But sometimes, you have to accept that you've got to have the backup and the support. And that's what's frustrated me in the UK, that I've not been able to convince the powers that be that pathologists should have that. And the reason, very quickly, is that we are 9/10 self-employed. I mean, so 9/10 of the pathologists, forensic pathologists in the United Kingdom, are self-employed.
Right.
So we have no employer, and therefore there is no responsibility for them to support us. And that's where the Home Office dives out the door and says, well, we don't employ you, we just regulate you. Therefore, we do not have to provide you with this support.
Goodness. That's a campaign that needs to be run.
Well, it's running. We're working on it. Some great, lovely colleagues up in Glasgow have done some research with the psychology department up there. There's a lot of support for it to happen. But you won't be surprised to hear that the bottom line is money.
The politics of pathology have changed over the course of your career as well. Funding much more difficult now for forensic pathology research. Also, you mentioned in your book the ability for proper consultation among experts before a prosecution or a trial.
Mm.
The fact that there's so little time, no time, in fact, now spent on really trying to establish the facts before, CPS make their decision or a trial gets underway. That's a big shift and a damaging one, isn't it?
Well, I remember it used to be the police that would make the decisions initially to charge, and then the CPS would sort of come along and try and sweep everything together afterwards. They've tried to make it a more logical process, and I do think that when it first happened, lots of enthusiasm was present. There was great enthusiasm within the lawyers to join the CPS, to get involved in this. And then they've run into a bureaucratic swamp, as all these big departments do. There's paperwork and there's documents and there's pressure and there's not enough staff and this, that, and the other. And the process bogs down. So at first the change was good, but slowly it slid into this morass where it's just taking too long. And for the immediate response to, can the experts talk? And I'm talking now about experts for the defence and the prosecution. Mm-hmm. Now, we should be able to talk together. The law says we can talk together. Why won't you let us? Because they feel that it can be done later, and as a result, really good decisions are sometimes delayed until so late on that people waiting to stand trial who probably shouldn't don't hear for months and months that in fact there's no evidence to support their prosecution and the case falls.
Yeah,
it happens not just in medicine. It happens throughout the legal system. And the wheels have to turn, but they do really need to start turning more efficiently.
Yes. And not least, we touched on mental health earlier, but the impact that can have on people's mental health is
absolutely
is considerable.
It rips people apart.
Indeed. But a huge part of your job is in court itself, giving evidence, as you say, for the prosecution or for the defence. You talk brilliantly about how quite often these big cases are subject to all kinds of, as in any situation that involves human beings, right? It's subject to all kinds of game playing, egos, agendas, and the pathologist is often the person stuck right in the middle and under attack.
Yeah.
Quite often, I understand you don't even get given the verdict at the end of the case. You have to go find that out for yourself.
Well, I read.
Tell me, that is a. Sorry to interrupt you. That is a. Those little things, in one case you can say, well, that's just a day at work. It's not just a day at work. That's you, in a witness box, kind of under attack. It's a real mini moment of crisis. How did you cope with those moments?
Well, I think, in a sense, because they are I always say it's a bit like entering a dance competition. You sort of know the moves, but you're not quite sure whether you're going to do a tango or a foxtrot. So you have to wait and listen to the mood music start up, and then you go, oh right, okay, we're into a foxtrot here. This is nice and slow, and then of course that barrister sits down, and the next one is playing a tango or something faster. The legal system in this country has so many good bits about it, but so many bits that really are jarring, and it is hard to stand in a witness box and be challenged by someone who actually has no particular knowledge and who you are pretty certain has not been advised to ask you the questions that they are asking you, but they're just, in a sense, taking them off the shelf as standard, not quite, but my client wasn't there, so how can you prove he was? That sort of question. And the pathologist, you have to smile sweetly. If experts lose their rag in the witness box, the barristers know that they have won. So it's
more than that, though, isn't it? Because you're not someone who's being brought in to kind of analyse the direction of a bullet, as perhaps some forensic experts would. You're also the guy who may well have been holding the knife over the body of the victim, and who has spent some time with that body, trying to fully understand what on earth happened, to make sure that the truth is discovered, that justice is brought to bear, but also, as you said earlier, for the family. So it's a much more personal thing for you, isn't it? When your judgment is being questioned in that way.
Yes, I mean, I think because we're used to the adversarial system. We're used to a colleague giving evidence and saying, well, yeah, I mean, we both agree that so-and-so was stabbed twice, but I think this was a really unfortunate accident, whereas he thinks it was clearly a murder. So I'm used to that sort of challenge, and you're quite happy, in a sense, to deal with it. If you're a good professional, you will have thought of all of the possible arguments before you even complete your report. And they should all have been dealt with in your report before it's sent in. But we're used to the challenge because that is how the adversarial system works. But it can sort of be done nicely and not nicely, if I can put it that way. And I would have to say that the harder I'm kicked, the more firm and more resilient I think I become. We're talking about.
It's just this idea that you've spent so much of your time, to be morbid about it, but that is the fact of your job, dealing with the dead, learning from the dead, as I mentioned earlier, but then having to switch to the nonsense of the living. All that sort of career-driven, game-playing, superficial self-centeredness, all that sort of nonsense. To be able to switch between those two things is another skill.
It is because the games that are being played, and I don't know if you've read the book The Secret Barrister, or whether you've interviewed him, her.
I haven't.
I don't know, but I thought it was a fantastic book. There's also another book called The Devil's Advocate, written by a High Court judge, that basically says, listen, the law is not there to find the truth. And if you think it's there to find the truth, don't do law. It is there to tell a story. Your job as a barrister is to tell a story. And we put two stories in front of the jury and we let them decide. Now, it works. It works pretty well most of the time.
It's the best system we've found so far.
Well, yes, I think it probably is. But we all have to accept it is not perfect. It is not perfect, and there's no doubt that it gets it wrong. But so my job is to not look at the barristers, and one of the things I learnt very early on from a very difficult barrister is never to look at them. I never, ever look at the barrister. I look at the jury, because the jury are the important people in court.
Yes, indeed. This fight for the truth, though, goes to the absolute core of what your job is all about, right? I mean, that's really what you are. That's what you're doing.
Yeah.
And there have been cases where it's your fight for the truth. It's your stubbornness and determination to stick with what you believe to be the correct version of the truth that has brought some astonishing moments. I mean, you have on a number of occasions been the embodiment of the inconvenient truth in the room, running against preconceived ideas of the police and and others. Can we talk about? There's a case in your new book about the young man who dies of a head injury after falling off a wall.
Yeah.
Could you just talk us through that example, because I think it captures that idea of you running against the grain.
Yes, I mean, very quickly, the new book looks at life and deaths through the seven ages. So I'm looking at people who've died from unnatural causes and natural causes in each of those things. We're looking at a man who, if I remember correctly, in his 20s, something like that, worked in the city, just become a new dad, everything really going for him. And he went out with his brother and some mates one night, had a few jars, and they ended up doing parkour. Now, I have to say, I didn't know what parkour was until this. But it is this sort of, you saw it at the beginning of a James Bond film, and if I was clever, I'd tell you which Bond film. But they just run over buildings, up buildings, down buildings, across roofs. Stunningly amazing stuff, but not for the faint-hearted. Anyway, he falls off the wall, fractures his skull, and dies. Tragic accident, except that people say that his brother, who was running behind him, pushed him off the wall. So we have a potential murder. And so we have a brother in the cells, and we have one brother in the cells and one brother in the mortuary. And it was one of those cases where the more I did the post-mortem, the more I felt that something was wrong. There is that, I talk about examinations and post-mortem dissection involving all 5 senses, but they also involve that little bit of sort of something at the back of your mind, that little niggle that says, what's wrong here? And in the end, the key to this case was his legs. His calves were of different sizes. And it was one of those, why are these legs, what's wrong with his legs? And the police were just saying, well, clearly his brother pushed him off. They got lots of background of niggles between the two brothers. The bottom line is that the niggle, we went off and I did some more extra research, and we showed that this lad was suffering from a muscular dystrophy, a congenitally inherited disease, which, when we look back at his life, it was beginning to affect him. He was losing his ability as a football team. He'd been dropped from the team. He probably knew his legs weren't as good as they once were.
Right.
And that gave a very,
where did that come from, though, from your perspective? A body is brought in who's clearly fallen off a wall and fractured his skull.
Yeah.
What leads you to think, I wonder if it's, let's take
Well, I won't claim that I thought it was muscular dystrophy that night, but what I knew was that his legs were odd. And, so much of pathology is that little bell tinkling at the back of your mind going, that's not quite right. Why is that not quite right? What else is wrong? And then the next day I went along, talked to colleagues in the hospital and said, what do you think? And they went, well, let's do these tests and let's check this and let's check that. But of course, it opened up a whole can of worms for that family, because it's an inherited disease.
Right, I see. So in the one hand, it kind of resolved what would have been a terrible kind of emotional trauma, the idea that one brother would kill another. There was another element to this as well, though, as I understand it, that you got to the truth thanks to a sort of £600 test in the end. Yeah. And that was a £600 test, as I understand it, that the system, let's not pick out individuals, but the system were pretty resistant about paying. That'd be ridiculous. This guy's been pushed off a wall. Why on earth would we spend £600? And that is fascinating to me, that someone's freedom really it can come down to one test in that way.
Yeah, well, it's in this case, it certainly did, and we would have got to doing this test, because I knew where I had to get to. We had to do this test, one way or another. Now, I would have to say, when I go back to the start of my career, the holistic approach to the health service was much greater. Post Thatcher, we're now in who pays for it. There's a cost. Who's going to pay for it? And if you can't pay for it, if you're not going to pay for it, we're not going to do it. Now, I don't want to go down that political line, but there was a time when I would simply have gone to the lab and said, I think it might be this. Could you do the tests to help me? We've lost that smooth professional to professional flow.
And the net result is that we have a system that is less reliable. I guess what I'm really doing here is making the case for the fundamental importance of what you do for a living and what your colleagues do for a living, because you are the people who are driving to get to the truth, and not, by the way, to get to the truth of some case involving financial impropriety or whatever. You're trying to get to the truth of what happened to someone who might have been murdered.
Yeah. But that's certainly true. I mean, the key thing here was we would have got there, but it would have been another 6 months or 9 months, maybe. We were able to get it done quicker and get the brother released and start talking to the family much faster than would have happened otherwise. But it's true of every death. That one of my colleagues says, do you want a cause of death or do you want the cause of death? Yes. Now, a lot of people say, we just do it, please. It's so disgusting what you do. Just give me a cause of death, and we can tuck it all under the carpet and move on. And but so much depends on getting it right and getting the right thing, even if it's hard for the family. And I'm sorry that it often has been. It is important that we pick up the fact this guy's been using spice. It really is relevant. You don't like it, but society's got to know what's going on.
Because how else do you move forward? Tell us how you'd cope day to day, in a mortuary. It's your place of work, so cope is probably the wrong word, but it's a true centre of crisis. And how are those brilliant people that you work with, right, handling those situations day to day? I suspect we often hear on this podcast how important humour is.
Yes,
I suspect even for you guys, that an environment that I know is completely covered in respect and governed by respect for the work that you do, but humour must have its place.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we have what's called a dirty side and a clean side. Yep. And between the two is some changing rooms where you get into your scrubs and you put on your wellies and you go through we call it the horse dip, but I mean, the sheep dip, you have to paddle through a pond of disinfectant water. So, and that's really the divide. So when we're on clean side, when we're outside, things are much more relaxed. Okay. I mean, people will talk about golf. They'll talk about their families. They'll talk about girlfriends. There is laughter. And most importantly, there are cups of tea and chocolate biscuits. I mean, that is the thing that makes the world go round. There's no doubt about it.
The greatest crisis cure. Yeah,
absolutely. And really good friends and colleagues. That's the other thing. I can think of some really, really fantastic people who are just tremendous at the work that they do day after day after day, managing bereaved relatives, helping the bereaved relatives, and talking to the bereaved relatives. Absolutely fantastic. Then we cross over to the dirty side, and really the sort of professional shields come up literally, now with COVID, all the gowns and the masks and whatever. Health and safety is critical, but so is mind health and safety, and helping people and watching your colleagues to make sure they're not suffering. Generally, I'm afraid, sadness is there, bereavement suites are there, but for us, it's a place of work. And we are there to do a job to the best of our ability with respect, but it is the job. It is looking and solving puzzles that we do on our side.
Yes, and the detachment is obviously critical for you, but as you've already explained, with implications for your own health and for the health of your colleagues. But talking about it in the way that you've done, obviously with your books, but I know you're going on tour soon as well. To tell to give your perspective on this. On your life, but also on the broader challenge of pathology. Do you see the tour as therapeutic? Do you find talking about it as therapeutic?
I think it's so important that people do talk about death. Now, so often now I hear the use of the word past. He's passed. Now, I don't say that's wrong, but I think it's hiding what's happened. I guess it's a shortening of passed on, and it seems to me to be slightly American. That seems to be the phraseology that I'm hearing from across the pond. But what's wrong with saying someone's died? They haven't done anything wrong. Not by dying, they haven't done anything wrong. So why are we hiding it? And then we hide the process, and we hide away from it. And talking to people whose relatives have died seems to be becoming a harder process as well, because we don't do it very often, thank goodness. Although COVID has changed that. I mean, it's stood everything on its head. Not being with your relatives when they die. Few people at funerals, the whole process of celebration of a life has altered. But even before that, I felt there was this, is this the right word? A dumbing down of death? It's just hiding it away. We don't want to talk about it. Oh, terrible.
I am in total agreement with you. And you see that? It's really interesting. So you see that as getting worse, actually, rather than because in so many other ways, our emotions are more public than they've ever been, haven't they? And social media is kind of driving that.
Yeah.
Kind of, everyone's got to tell everyone what they're thinking and feeling at any moment. In your book, actually, you refer to Facebook as the sort of devil's window. I think you're quoting someone else, but I love
the police call it the devil's window because
absolutely. But your analysis, though, is despite that, actually under the surface, we're not talking about the things that matter. That we're not actually kind of, being grown up about death and being celebratory when appropriate. Of course, it's not always appropriate, is it? Because
death of anyone is an awful event, but it is an event that we're all going to have to suffer of our relatives, but suffer also ourselves. So it shouldn't be seen as a failure. I mean, it is sad, when someone is no longer there to hold your hand, to chat about the news, to exchange stories. That's sad.
Yeah.
But they've had a life.
Let's talk quickly about the sort of changes that you've seen from a human perspective during the course of your career. The bodies that you see now are more ornate, I suspect, than ever before, thanks to the kind of, the tattoo industry. I assume you've noticed the rise in obesity is very marked and clear.
Very definitely.
Yeah. What else?
I think obesity is the thing that is the most striking. And as I say, tattoos are now so almost ubiquitous. To see someone without a tattoo, it almost brings notice, whereas before having tattoos did so. They're also a point of interest sometimes at the post-mortem when the tattoos, it's almost as the girlfriends have been changed, the tattoo has been done and the one above it has been obliterated above, by as they move down the girlfriends. So it's a social marker. I don't have any tattoos. I wouldn't want a tattoo because I know that in 30 years' time they will be rather grey and wishy-washy and not very pleasant.
Yes.
So, but that's my choice. Others go a different way. I think the other things are the piercings and the body art and the decorations and the augmentations of bodies. All of these things change.
Yeah. And the causes of deaths. Obviously, during your time of your career, one imagines a significant uptick in deaths as a result of drug abuse.
Yes. Sadly, it's just the drugs that change. It seems. Yes. When I started out, there were barbiturates, then there was distalgesic, and now we're into the opiates and the synthetic cannabinoids, the spice type drugs. That just the sad thing. There is nothing, I think, sadder than seeing a young 20-year-old, 18-year-old, 20-year-old, 25-year-old dead, because they took drugs. And life is and can be very hard, I know, but one senses that this is an utter tragedy for them and their family. And it benefits. I don't know how society is going to manage that because too many people benefit from it.
Yeah. More positively, as we come to the end of the conversation, what positive sort of trends do you see for us as human beings, as someone who is kind of they're absolutely at the front line to be able to judge it?
Well, I think I was getting more optimistic until we had COVID, and then COVID has dampened that optimism considerably because it has clearly shifted the whole of medicine throughout the world in a way that is going to affect our children and probably our children's children. And so there is that concern. Sorry, I will try and get to a.
I'm going to drag you.
Yeah,
kicking and screaming.
But when I look at the surgical procedures that can be performed now, life-saving procedures, once again, just jumping back to my mum with her heart disease, and if she could have had a valve replacement then. They hadn't been invented. So, I mean, it wasn't as though they were there and she couldn't have it. They had not been invented till about 5 or 6 years after she died. She would have gone on to live a longer life. She wouldn't have lived till she was 90, I'm sure. But she would have gone on and lived a much longer life. And the medical and the surgical procedures and treatments we have now, the increasing knowledge that people have about their own bodies. A lot of people ignore it, but people are taking notice about diet and about exercise and things of that sort, and that's got to be a good thing. But I'm afraid the death rates just keep rising, and it is sad that so many people don't feel there is any benefit in taking care and looking after and cherishing themselves and their families, and I think that's very sad.
Okay.
That was the uptick, was it? I'm sorry.
That was the attempted uptick. Dick, before we move on to your crisis cures, I just want to say thank you, really, for your time today, but also for the work that you do. We've touched on it in this conversation, but it's not just a case that someone's got to do it. It's not that at all, is it? It's absolutely fundamental to us all that this work continues in the way that you've been doing for so many years.
Yeah, society
it's the toughest of jobs, but just thank God that there are people like you who do it.
I'm thank you for your thanks, but I am so lucky to have had a career that I discovered when I was 13, and I am now 69, and I have thoroughly enjoyed not every moment of it, but it has been a very fulfilling, exciting, and satisfying career.
Good. Let's talk about your crisis cures. So these are three things that you've leaned on during tough times in your life. Let's start with the one that we touched on earlier, because I know that flying for you is incredibly important.
Yeah.
Tell me why.
It's so different. It's got nothing to do with my day-to-day life. It's to climb into my little plane. It's one that I share. I don't own one myself, so I belong to a group, and we share the costs and the expenses and the fun. But just to climb into that and to be able to take off into a blue sky and fly down the coast of England, to fly over to France, to go and have a meal in the cafe in a French restaurant in the evening, and then fly back the next day. It is intellectually quite interesting, because there's lots of stuff you have to read and to do and take exams in. So I suppose there is that bit that ticks it. But it is the freedom. It is the fact that I can get in and I can go off and I can enjoy myself and have.
You can't think about anything else.
No, actually, it is a very good clearer of minds. Actually, It really is. When you take off, you think, "Oh, I've got to get this thing back down on the ground somehow." So
it's somewhat important. Yeah. Okay. Give me your second crisis cure, please.
Music, I think, is where I go to. I love music. I love music of all types. I'm very broad church, but if I'm very stressed, I do like a couple of the Mozart operas, Marriage of Figaro and Così fan tutte. But there's a particular song that I love from Così fan tutte, just the end of Act One. I mean, the story I just think is tremendously typically Mozartian, and but when the people are going off and it's "May the Winds Be Gentle," and it's the most beautiful bit of music, and I've seen it performed lots of times. I saw the Jonathan Miller production of Così fan tutte in Seattle. I mean, I don't often drop names, but it was one of those moments. Really, it was just filled my life. It was tremendous. The other end of the spectrum is when I'm a bit grumpier and I need just a bit of winding up. Then there's always "Brick in the Wall" by Pink Floyd, which really, really gets me going.
Very good. You have one more.
Reading. I'm not very good at reading, partly because I usually fall asleep. So I holidays are the time that I read. But I love the book 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. It is a fabulous book. conceptually and the way it's written and put together, following this family over 7 generations through 100 years. It's just a tremendous story that's always taken me page turning from one to the next. The stories of this family are so utterly wonderful, and I can keep going back to that book and finding such interest in it. Not a lot of forensic interest, I have to say. Some other books I enjoy the forensic interest, but this one is just a fantastic story, brilliantly told.
Superb. Dick, thank you so much for your time today. It's
My
been
pleasure.
A fascinating conversation. And as I say, can't thank you enough for your time. Can't thank you enough for your work.
Well, thank you, Andy. It's been a great pleasure talking to you.